Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're heading straight into the heart of the Himalayas to examine a fascinating yet intensely dangerous geographical marvel, the Bhote Koshi River. This river originates way up in the high-altitude glaciers of the Tibetan Autonomous Region in China and then plunges sharply down into central Nepal. But we aren't just looking at a river today. We're exploring one of the most hazardous hydrometeorological corridors on the planet. We're going to break down the sheer geographical forces at play, the real human impact, and how engineering might just be the key to survival.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at a river's deadly duality. Then, we'll dissect the anatomy of the corridor itself to understand the geographic triggers. Third, we'll review the historical cycle of destruction. Fourth, we'll uncover the true cost of these floods. And finally, we'll look at the blueprint for engineering a safer future. Starting with Section 1. A river's deadly duality, thrills versus threats. So the Bhote Koshi is a river of intense paradox. There's this stark phrase from our source material, floating Bhote Koshi. Now, on the surface, that sounds kind of poetic, right? Maybe even serene. But in the context of this specific Himalayan region, it represents a completely terrifying reality. This really illustrates that paradox perfectly. On one hand, you have the expectation. The Bhote Koshi is globally celebrated as this premier destination for thrill-seeking whitewater rafting. People literally travel from all over the world just to ride these rapids. But on the other hand, you have the grim reality for the locals, because when high-altitude natural dams fail, it isn't just rafts floating down the river. Entire communities, vital trade routes, and massive hydropower grids literally float away in this high-velocity surge. It's wild. Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of the Corridor. A multi-hazard cascade. To really understand why this happens, we have to look at the extreme geology at play here. The Bhote Koshi is a primary tributary of the Sun Koshi, and its defining feature is its extreme gradient. Trace this geographic cascade with me. It starts way up on the upper Tibetan Plateau, which is home to these massive glaciers. From there, it hits the transboundary border between China and Nepal, dropping thousands of vertical meters in a very brief geographic span. It basically acts like a giant funnel, accelerating everything right into high debris catchment zones in Nepal, towns like Tatopani and Barhabase, before eventually emptying into the downstream Sun Koshi basin. Now keep that steep funnel in your mind as you consider this number, 15 to 20. That is the estimated rate in meters that Himalayan glaciers are retreating annually due to climate change. So every single year, 15 to 20 meters of glacial ice simply melts away. And that water doesn't just disappear. It collects behind these highly unstable natural walls of rock and ice called moraines, forming massive, really precarious high-altitude lakes. Which brings us to the ultimate catalyst for disaster in this high-altitude terrain, the GLOF, or glacial lake outburst flood. So what happens is, when those unstable moraine dams we just talked about finally breach, they release millions of cubic meters of water, thick mud, and heavy boulders. And it happens with virtually no warning. This massive slurry just cascades down that steep vertical drop straight into Nepal's narrow river valleys. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how these are rarely isolated events. They're multi-hazard cascades. A GLF from the upper border can actually act as a trigger for other disasters. We also have landslide dam outburst floods, or LDOFs, triggered by heavy monsoons collapsing the slopes. Then there's seismic-induced slope instability, where earthquakes literally loosen the Himalayan bedrock. And finally, debris flows, locally known as ledo, which is a terrifying surge of mud, tree trunks, and massive boulders. So one single trigger can set off this entire chain reaction.
That brings us to Section 3, a cycle of destruction, the historical precedent.
Because you see, these multi-hazard cascades aren't just theoretical models. If we track the historical timeline, the sheer frequency is honestly pretty alarming. Back in July 1981, the Zhangzhangbo GLOF breached in Tibet, sending a massive surge that literally destroyed the Friendship Bridge. Then, in August 2014, the Jure landslide hit. Just months later, the devastating Gorkha earthquake struck in the spring of 2015. After that, a massive flash flood in July 2016 wiped out homes in Tatopani. And bringing us right up to the present, the 2025 and 2026 climate outburst events just continued to sweep away transit bridges and completely disrupt trade. To really put the sheer scale of these events into perspective, consider that 2014 Jure landslide. A mountain slope collapsed directly into the river and created a dam of debris 55 meters high. That is roughly the height of an 18-story building. The lake it created submerged entire villages before violently breaching and sweeping away everything downstream. And remember those 2015 earthquakes from the timeline we just looked at? That severe ground shaking fractured the mountain slopes, basically leaving millions of loose rock fields just sitting there, ready to slide down during any heavy monsoon.
All right, Section 4, the true cost of floods, impacts beyond the riverbanks.
It's absolutely crucial that we shift our focus from the raw geology to the real human toll here. The economic domino effect is staggering. The Bhote Koshi corridor hosts key arterial supply routes connecting Nepal to China, heavily relying on the Arniko Highway. So the crucial point is, when a flood washes away a stretch of this highway, all cross-border commerce just grinds to a halt. Perishable cargo and raw materials are stranded for months. And because of this supply chain bottleneck, market prices all the way in the Kathmandu Valley dramatically inflate. Literally, a glacier melting in Tibet directly impacts the cost of living for a family in Kathmandu. It's a massive chain reaction.
And when we zoom in locally, the impacts are just devastating. The Bhote Koshi Basin is a major hub for Nepal's hydroelectric output, but these debris-laden surges cause heavy siltation, they submerge turbines, and essentially force hydro plants to shut down, which slashes regional power capacity. Meanwhile, you have communities facing constant bank erosion, with properties that were built on ancient river terraces suddenly left dangling on cliff edges. Oh, and that whitewater rafting ecotourism we mentioned at the very start, it faces extreme seasonal volatility simply because the actual topography of the river changes violently from year to year.
Which leads us to Section 5, engineering a safer future, mitigating transboundary risk.
We're obviously not just here to look at the devastation. Protecting these communities requires a huge shift toward proactive climate resilience, and this is the comprehensive blueprint for survival. Now, managing a transboundary river inherently requires international diplomacy. Let's move to and see how this builds. Step 1 is hydromet data exchange, so real-time tracking of water levels shared across borders. Step 2 translates that data into physical mitigation, things like early drainage of dangerous lakes and bioengineering those unstable slopes. And finally, Step 3 is building resilient infrastructure by enforcing strict setback zones to keep people completely out of harm's way.
Diving into the specific technical and policy priorities, establishing transboundary early warning systems, or TWS, between Nepal and China is absolute priority number 1, because these triggers usually originate in Tibet. Those downstream communities need that real-time radar data to evacuate in time. Structurally, we have to stop building on loose sediment and start anchoring bridges deep into stable bedrock. And maybe most impressively, engineers are looking at controlled glacial lake lowering. There's actually a successful track record here. Risk reduction projects at Imja and Shrorolpa proved that engineering teams can successfully and artificially siphon water from dangerous superglacial lakes to maintain safe water levels. Lastly, local governments absolutely must enforce setback zones that prohibit construction on active floodplains and unstable debris fields. The story of the floating Bhote Koshi is essentially a masterclass in the dangerous, real-world impacts of our changing global climate. Extreme precipitation and melting glaciers are only escalating these risks. So we are left with a pretty critical question. As Himalayan temperatures continue to rise, will proactive transboundary management outpace the next flood? It's literally a race against time, geology, and climate. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.